I think it's a really good question, and I think it's one which requires a nuanced answer. And I say that because if we attach violence affecting young people with black or brown families, someone watching this could assume that actually violence equals black people. And I think that's a dangerous assumption. Black people didn't invent violence. In fact, most of the crimes in this country, by the nature of the population, are done by white people, right? So we have to be really careful. In the context that I work with my charity, in a particular London context, we have to appreciate that why I don't think this is a black issue, we have to appreciate that there's a disproportionate amount of black and brown children who unfortunately have lost their life to youth violence over the last 10 years in a London context. That doesn't mean it's a black issue, but there's a disproportionality which happens. But then stats has recently come out to say that actually where the violence hotspots are for young people are in the home counties. Hertfordshire, Surrey, places like this where you're saying, oh, okay, and in terms of where black people are, there are not that many there. So we have to understand this is a youth culture conversation. We've seen some high profile murders recently of the young trans girl who was killed up, I can't remember where it was, but we know that was a white girl. In answer to your question, I say all that to say the answer to your question is that I think where we have to have a very contextualized view of compassion. So when I say that, if you are in a London context and the demographic is high, where there's black and brown children, you need to then engage with what the issues are with the youth of that particular area and context. If that, and some of those issues will be highly racialized, and you then as a church need to engage with that. If you are in another area of the UK and there's youth violence, it might not be black and brown people involved. You still need to engage and show compassion in that context if you are a church leader. I'm just nervous about attaching race with violence affecting young people. My response though is just because you may be living in the valleys of Wales and you see a London context where maybe there are a disproportionate amount of black and brown children being impacted by violence, it doesn't stop you from A, praying, it doesn't stop you from B, plowing resources into that conversation. Because we serve a big God and we pray where there's pain and there's suffering. And that question we said earlier on, who is your neighbour, is something which you really do need to hold and take seriously.
I think on that point, it's going back to the issue about, there are no black, Asian, minority ethnic people in my community. The fact is that what you just said, you're in Wales, you see this, is how the media plays into people in your congregation. So, they're going and reading the tabloids, they're switching on the TV, the radio, etc. And so they're fed this monolithic kind of viewpoint, which, we're in a racialized society, it percolates. This media thing is filtering through. So I think if there's one place we really need to call it out, is in the media, because
Can I just jump
in?
Because I think your point is a really good one. I'll give you a very quick example. I went on holiday with my family a couple of years ago, went to Snowdon, climbed mountains and all that type of stuff, which was great, stayed on a farm. Turned on the TV and Newsnight was on. And a friend of mine, Governor B, was on Newsnight, and I think he was talking about drill artists and the connection to crime. And I'm watching all this imagery with drill artists and stuff. And from a London context, none of this stuff surprises me. But for a moment, I'm sitting watching this in Snowdon in North Wales. And I said to my wife, I said, my goodness, if I was a white person in Snowdon watching this, I would think that London is crazy. Or wherever black people are is absolutely just zombie knives and all types of stuff. Which is why context is important. Sometimes I work with teachers who have come from places outside of the inner cities, And I say to them, what is your experience of black and brown children? And they can only say to me, well, I've watched this program, what was it called? Top Boy. So I'm like, oh my goodness, hold on, you're now coming into a school where my children might be at, and you've only engaged with black children by watching a program all about gangs and violence. Hence the reason why there is a responsibility for us as, well, church leaders to become what I would call more culturally aware and culturally sensitive to the context that you are working in. I don't expect anyone to be in a position of power, particularly in a space where there's black and brown people, if you have not got a cultural awareness, intelligence, and understanding of the communities that you are serving. And the serving is the most important thing. And that goes to police, that goes to teachers, and that goes to pastors, it goes to doctors, it goes to anyone where you are serving. Get your stuff together and be in a space where you are teachable. Teachable, because so much about this is about arrogance and a lack of humility to come under somebody else who knows more about you, about this particular cultural context.
But that's power dynamics, if I may come there, because picking up from, if you're a doctor, how you should be culturally aware as well. One of the things we're very keen on doing now is making sure that future medics, from the moment they enter medical school as a student, they are taught to be culturally aware. And that means we're going to take some black patients and put before them. Because oftentimes you can be taught from expertise or the textbooks, but there's nobody that can give you the knowledge and the expertise that you require than somebody who's had the lived experience of the very thing that you're trying to treat. And understanding how different communities face diseases in terms of setup at home, carers or access to carers and things like that does play a part in the conversation. If people just go in naively and said, one model fits all, that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
So I completely support that view.
I was going to ask you actually, do you think we live in a post-racial society? I don't really know what post-racial means, but do you think we live in one?
I'm trying to stretch my imagination to that place. We do not live in one, but I'm trying to stretch my imagination to a place to say perhaps it's possible. I don't think it is. I do not have much hope to offer here. If I go back historically, anthropologically speaking, anthropology being the study of human groups and people groups and how they grow and develop in cultures and communities and how that's developed over time. Anthropology did a very evil thing in the 17th century in that it divided and separated people into races. And those who had darker pigmented skills were put at the bottom of the pile because they were seen as aggressive, animalistic, and were therefore prime targets to be studied and subjected to harsh labor, whereas those with lighter pigmentation were put at the top. And it proliferated from there because the academic thinkers bought into it, the politicians bought into it, those who lived in the upper echelons of society bought into it. In other words, the systems, the institutions, the structures, they bought into it, and it proliferated over time. We can go through many cases in history how that has proliferated, and it continues to this modern day. It's spoken about differently. We're doing tokenism gestures differently, but it continues. And for it to stop, for us to have a post-racial society, we need to disrupt completely those power structures, which means we cannot allow people to inherit power who think the same way, who view life the same way, who've been raised the same way, having the same conversations and feelings about other people. Once we disrupt that, then perhaps there's potential, but there's an ongoing transfer of power amongst the same people group with a similar opinion, and therefore post-racial society is a very far stretch of the imagination.
Can I say something quickly? I'm just reflecting on, and I might not be fully answering from the perspective that you're speaking, but I'm just thinking that for me, even the the idea that the desire to be post-racial, I find it quite difficult. And I speak as somebody who, born in the UK, raised in the UK, clearly a black person of Jamaican parentage. And I can remember as a child, it was in the days when people still, quite frequently spoke about people being colored, and actually it was a time when to be called black was actually often seen as an insult. So maybe it was preferable to be called colored than black. But then even then, to be colored or to be black was an insult. To be colored, you're lesser. And so, you're still inferior somehow. And I know that I have been I had to be, not that I was consciously choosing to do this. I almost had no choice, but I was on a journey to embrace my blackness. And at some point I realized that, you know what, I'm not colored, I'm black. And as I'm saying, my back is coming up and my back is straight. I'm black, that's right, that's who I am, I'm black. And so then now when I hear people say things like, for example, oh, there's nothing to do with black and white, we're all the same, we're all one human race and all that. Yes, we are one human race, but I know I'm black. And don't try to take my blackness from me, because it was a hard journey. It was a hard journey to accept and embrace and be proud of my blackness. And sometimes I have a friend, he says, what a strange thing we say when we say you're proud to be black. You had no choice in being black. You just are. You were born that. You didn't do anything. It's not like you earned it. And I say, I understand exactly what you're saying. And yet, I know I'm proud to be black. Don't try to take it from me.
I may briefly pick up on that. So I touched more on the sort of structural side of things, and you picked it up from the very individual perspective, which is the other side of the coin, and incredibly valid. Let me pick up on that as well, because you touched on the point that you are of Jamaican parentage and heritage, and I'm sure you'll share the experience that if you were to visit Jamaica, they would not make you feel like you belong, because there's something about the tone of how you engage with the dialect there that doesn't quite fit in. And likewise, you come back to the UK and still there's this othering that takes place, and effectively you're a misfit. Exactly. That you do not quite settle in and belong anywhere. And I suppose the point I'm trying to make here is that to get towards post-racism or post-racial, get to a post-racial society, there's a healing that needs to take place at the individual level. And that healing is a reconciliation of where do I belong? Who am I? What's my identity? What's my place in society? Where is my land? Who are my people? Entire history that we have been separated and severed from. I don't know my family, my African family. Who are they? What's their name, etc. So there's all of that to reconcile. And so it feels like you're starting over again each and every day, which means it's not just about what institutions or society might do. It's about the trauma that individuals have experienced that they now have to work through over several generations to even get any sense of equity.
But I think it's important to appreciate that there are some people who believe we are in a post-racial society. And that is demonstrated by some of the reports that our government has put out. Institutional racism doesn't exist. That was the Sewell report. That was the headline from the Sewell report. So we have to appreciate that maybe most of us or all of us around this table saying, post-racial society, that's ridiculous. I'm not sure that's what we should be aiming for anyway. But there's another narrative which is being pushed in our government, which is very much like the conversation around race. We need to move on. We shouldn't be having D&I conversations. We shouldn't be having racial literacy conversations in particular government departments or in our schools. And actually, we've put out reports to say that things are so much better now. What are we moaning about? The Rivers of Blood speech in the 60s does not count to what is going on here. However, that doesn't represent what is going on a street ground level. And therefore, I think the conversation about post-racial society is a bit of a red herring, because I think some people think that anyway, and a majority of black and brown people will be like, we're never going to get there anyway. So I'm not being critical of the question. I'm just saying it's kind of an interesting.
And that's why I said I don't know what it means, because it depends on what your view or your picture of what post-racial is. And the reason why some people, I don't agree with it, but the reason why some people see it as we've already attained that is because they've seen a few black and brown faces around the boardroom, and so to them, they're like, tick, great. Look at how inclusive we are. Look at how far we've gone. Great, we've got one black or Asian person who is in our team, on our management team, nobody else in the organization, but just that one person, and like, look, great, we've come a long way. Look at how diverse we are. Let's get your photo on the website, and so all of those things become the goal for some people instead of genuine equity and justice. And so behind you is a sign, because I keep looking at it going, rediscovering justice. And unless it becomes about justice, unless it becomes about genuine equity and treating you as a brother, as someone made in the image of God, carrying value, it will never be enough until we get to that goal, And so the stuff we give you to keep you happy should never be enough until we've achieved justice. And
Sorry.
Now, I was going to say there is an arrogance to assume that we're happy.
Yeah, you didn't ask me.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an absolute arrogance there to think that your philosophies actually changes structure or makes my life any differently. And you're right. It goes back to the conversation of justice, doing what's right. It's right action based on right thinking, right heart. And you said earlier about loving your neighbor. Until we see each other as neighbors, genuine neighbors, community with a common focus, and look out for one another, seldom much is going to change.
Just quickly, I know we're running out of time, but I just want to say there's a quote which I've used quite a few times, and I think it's really important for this conversation. Accessibility is being able to get in the building. Diversity is getting invited to the table. Inclusion is having a voice at the table. Belonging is having your voice heard at the table. I always say most churches think they're really good at the accessibility bit. Well, you know, we have a lift in our building, and that means if you're disabled, you can get in. We're accessible. Most people say we're diverse. Well, we've got this person and that person. Look at our website. Okay, where it gets interesting is when you start talking about inclusion and belonging. And part of the problem I have is that the table, the decision-making table, still doesn't look like this table. And I'm not necessarily saying it has to be all black and brown people around the table making decisions for everybody. But give us one or two people. That's problem number one. Problem number two is that often then, when you're talking about the black and brown people who do manage to get around the decision-making table, they're of a certain ilk. Well, you're well educated. In some contexts, they tend to be of African descent as opposed to Caribbean. This would be just my personal, like you said earlier on, this is just my experience, not everybody's experience. And they tend to have a certain value system, what plays into almost a white supremacy way of doing things. And that's the reality.
The framework hasn't changed.
Yeah.
Framework
But that's what I was going to say.
Unless
That's
the
what I was going to
framework
say.
changes,
Yes.
we haven't
Yes.
actually shifted anything. I
No.
heard this phenomenal professor, and he said, the slave ship is still amongst us. You can still hear the beating of the drum. It's just the different levels of the decks of the ship are just now different skyscrapers and corporate buildings, but it's still here.
Well, there's the house and there's the field. And we all know what when I say that, but historically, you know what we're talking about. There are those who are on the ground doing the work, and there are those who aim to be in the big house.
We saw that in the COVID-19 pandemic. There were those who were able to isolate and work from home. And then there were those who were still running the supermarkets, working in the care homes. As a result, the statistics are showing they were disproportionately impacted. Their communities were dying out. And so you're right, it's so unequal. And I think that entire pandemic just brought out some of those inequalities and injustices that you can't ignore, even if you try to.
But the problem is this, what white leaders will see, they will take the successful, or what the world determines as being successful, and say, we'll bring you on our board of trustees, we'll make you an elder, we'll do that. And why is anybody else complaining? Even though that black person cannot relate to me or you or anybody else. So this monolithic, I think you mentioned it, this monolithic approach that we often have. The other thing which I think we're scared of is contradicting narratives. Yeah. Oh, but you know, Ben said this, so it must be right. Well, no, but hold on. You know, somebody else has said something else, or that must be right. I think when we're talking about moving forward, what we cannot be afraid of is having multiple narratives. It is okay if you want to be on the ground protesting and fighting the power. And it's actually okay if you choose to do that in a boardroom context as well. It shouldn't be either or. But when we're talking about moving forward, too many people say, well, if you're doing that, you've sold out, right? You're in the boardroom, you've got the doctorate, you've taken an OBE, whatever it is, you've sold it. Oh, you're on the ground, or you're not intelligent enough to really understand how the mechanics and structures work. No, hold on. Why can't we have multiple or even contradicting narratives to work together for a better future? And I think that is a conversation we don't like having in our own community.
But the problem there, especially looking at it from a church context, is that we don't know how to move from protest to policy, in that we like to protest, we wait for the next event to occur for us to protest. And then once that is settled down in the news media, we go quiet as well and wait for the next thing to happen. And then we have something to say. The interim periods when so many things are happening that may not be captured by the media, our voices are silenced. And that just tells me what you referred to there about, Ben, about someone may be in the boardroom, they may be seen as a sold out, is because people are not uniting to have the conversations beyond the protest.
Because we've been, and I was saying this, that what's been sown into our soil is colonialism, which is divide and conquer. And it's sown so deeply into our soil that we are still living in the fruits of it, and we're still living out the fruits of that toxic seed in so many of our community that actually when we see somebody do something a little bit different, fighting the same fight, but you're just doing it a different way, we're like, hell no, we can't back that, you know? Rather than we're coming behind you